studying the history and prehistory of the Native Americans of Northeast Michigan, particularly back in the 1980s and early 1990s, I did a lot of avocational archaeology work in the Oscoda area. I was able to, and I feel honored to have been able to actually go out and touch that prehistory firsthand, to hold it and examine it. And I was also very privileged and honored to be able to talk to Native American people that shared stories with me, and Chief John Nagonigan and his wife Susie, and Hazel Lavoie. Very special and very dear people, unfortunately now gone, but their memory will always live on to everybody that knew them. But being that Michigan is a state surrounded on three sides by large bodies of water, and the land itself has many lakes and streams, you would think that we would have legends of lake monsters here in Michigan, and we do. And they were actually, some of them were shared with me by these people I already mentioned, about Meshepeshew. And Meshepeshew was a giant mountain lion that was believed by the Native Americans to live under the waters of the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Huron, and that with the swishing of its immense tail caused the sudden and violent storms that often would come up on the lake. But in going back through my files, I found some notes that I had made a long time ago, and I'd like to share those with you now about Meshepeshew. You see, Meshepeshew is part of the Ojibwa Indians' mythology from the beautiful waters of Lake Superior, Michigan, and also Lake Huron. He is believed to live within the lake and travels by underwater tunnels, but his main home is Meshepeshew Island, Ontario. It is said that where the lake is the greenest, that is where he is. Meshepeshew is mostly known as a large serpent-like feline, Meshepeshew meaning the great lynx, with copper horns atop his head. He is known within this mythology as being very cunning and tricky indeed. To some, he can be helpful, but he enjoys drowning trespassers, especially children. There are a few stories that might be of true believers of this great beast. Stories by a Jesuit missionary named Claude Dablon. And he told a story about 4 Ojibwa Indians who embarked on a journey to the home of Meshepeshew to take some copper back to their home and use it to heat water. And the very second they pushed off and back into the water with their canoe, the eerie voice of the water panther surrounded them. The water panther became angry, and he came growling after them vigorously, accusing them of stealing the playthings of his children, the copper. And all 4 of the Indians died on the way back to their village, the last one surviving just long enough, to tell the tale of what had happened in his final moments before he finally died. During the 1840s, there was a copper rush in Michigan. People had realized the value of copper, which was just there for the taking on Isle Royale and around the Upper Peninsula, the Keweenaw Peninsula. There was great suffering and accidents that many key people and vessels fell victim to. The steamer Cumberland, for example, was lost at the Rock of Ages Reef on Isle Royale. And another ship by the name of Algoma was sunk in a storm during 1885, and 45 people sunk to a watery death in the Meshepeshew's lair. An underwater panther called Meshepeshew in Ojibwe is one of the most important of several water beings among the Great Lakes and northeastern woodland Native American tribes, particularly among the Anishinaabe peoples. Meshepeshew, as I told you already, translates into the great lynx. It has the head and paws of a giant cat, but is covered in scales and has dagger-like spikes running along its back and tail. Meshepeshew calls, as I also said, Meshepeshew Island in the Lake Superior his home, and is a powerful creature in the mythological traditions of some Native American tribes, particularly Anishinaabe tribes, and Ottawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi of the Great Lakes region of Canada and the United States. But if you will also look at the video I have put on here, Ancient Coins of the Great Lakes, A series of discs were, I'll just briefly say, a series of stone discs were found at a number of sites on Thunder Bay up at Alpena, Michigan. And these discs are of late woodland in origin, 500 to 1400 years old. And they are etched onto the surface are images of the mystical beings in the Anishinaabe mythology or mythos. Meshepeshew is depicted on a number of those coins and looks just like the description I just read to you on his particular coin or token. And another one which is very prominent there is the Thunderbird. I believe Thunderbird was Anamiki. I may be mistaken on that. But the Thunderbird was the great protector, and he had power over Meshepeshew because he would be able to cast huge thunderbolts or huge lightning bolts at Meshepeshew in the water, and he could subdue him. I call these coins or tokens because my belief is that the Indians in on the Thunder Bay used them to pacify the spirits in the lake, particularly Meshepeshew, for safe passage across the lake. So, but at any rate, to the Algonquins, the underwater panther was the most powerful underworld being that existed, and the Ojibwe traditionally held them to be masters of all water creatures, including the snakes. And some versions of the Nanabazu creation legend refer to whole communities of water lynx. And some archaeologists believe that underwater panthers were major components of the southeastern ceremonial complex of the Mississippian culture in the prehistoric American Southeast. Native American mythologies of the Great Lakes describe underwater panthers as monsters that live in opposition to the thunderbirds, which I just said, masters of the powers of the air. Underwater panthers are seen as an opposing yet complementary force to the thunderbirds, and they engaged in an eternal conflict. Underwater panthers, or panther, was an amalgam of features from many different animals. As I already said, the body was feline. Often the mountain lion or lynx was associated with it. The horns of deer or bison, upright scales on its back, and occasionally bird feathers, and parts from other animals as well, depending on the particular myth that you're reading. Underwater panthers are represented with exceptionally long tails and occasionally with serpentine properties. As I said, the creatures are thought to roar or hiss in the sounds of storms of rushing rapids on the Great Lakes and causing those storms. The Meshepeshew were said to live in the deepest parts of the lakes and rivers, where they can cause great storms. Some traditions believe the underwater panthers to be helpful, protective creatures, but more often they were viewed as malevolent beasts that brought death and misfortune along with them. They often needed to be placated for safe passage across the lake, as I said. And as late as the 1950s, the Prairie Band of Potawatomi Indians performed a traditional ceremony to placate the underworld panther and maintain balance with the thunderbird. When ethnographer Johann Cole visited the United States in the 1850s, he spoke with a Fond du Lac chief who showed Cole a piece of copper kept in his medicine bag, and the chief said it was a strand of hair from Meshepeshew, and thus considered it extremely powerful. The history of Meshepeshew is merely a legend for some, but for the Algonquin Indians and their relatives, it is as real as the water and precious metal that it guarded. Meshepeshew is known for guarding the vast amounts of copper in Lake Superior and the Great Lakes region. There seems to be substantial evidence that there was a very ancient and unknown people that mined copper and moved the majority to an undisclosed location. But later, during the 17th century, the Jesuit missionaries arrived in the Great Lakes region, and by that time, swiping copper from the region was extremely taboo and forbidden by the Ojibwa tribe. It was even worse to take it from the Great Lakes home, Meshepeshew Island. This was considered to be stealing from Meshepeshew himself. There are a few stories that might be true, as I said. Jesuit missionaries It told tales of the water panther. And the thing, an interesting side note here is that as we look at legends, and even as we look at more recent sightings, it is believed by many that Michigan waters indeed do have monsters, if you will, living in them. One, for example, is known as Saggy, and it's a creature that was sighted on Saginaw Bay. And a person wrote this: after reading a few of your stories on here, it's reminded me of a few of my own. My family owns a very old home on Saginaw Bay, and since it was very little, since I was just very little, I've always felt watched. That whole area is just eerie to me. My father and I would go canoeing and kayaking through the Saginaw Bay, and he would tell me about Saggy, which is the Saginaw Bay equivalent of Nessie, I suppose. I don't know if I imagined seeing it after hearing this, but that whole bay is very scary to me. Strange bumps in the water that I truly know aren't fish, and I'm sure it may have something to do with the Lake Huron too. I'm supposing that Lake Huron is where this monster is. I know there's something out there, and after years of kayaking, I know what a bump from a wave feels like. Water is scary in general, especially when you can't see beneath you. That's my only scary story of the water. The story of my one sighting of Saggy of Saginaw Bay. There's another water monster of Stearns Bayou, and this is from a vintage article, and I'm going to read to you from this fascinating account, actually. A water monster spotted in the murky waters of Stearns Bayou, located in Grand Haven Township, Michigan. Decide for yourself if it was just the imaginations of some early 20th century party people, or if there really was a water monster lurking in the depths of the bayou. Below are all the reports, or following are all the reports from the Grand Haven Tribune when this creature was first sighted. And it sounds like they had a drunken good time, if you ask me. But that was not my notation. That was another writer's notation. It was also discovered that Stearns Bayou was home to some monster-sized lake sturgeon and muskies back in the day. In the 1960s, a very large muskie was pulled out of the waters, and its head is mounted and on display at Felix's gun shop right on Stearns Bayou Bridge. People have reported seeing dark shapes under the water that were large, that were thought to be logs until they moved. And muskie can get quite large, but sturgeon are especially large and very beast-like in appearance. They're actually living fossils. They can weigh over 200 pounds and grow to over 6 feet. Now that's a monster. If people were seeing something like this, it's no wonder they thought that they were dealing with a bona fide monster. Now comes the report from up the river of another sea serpent seen in the waters of Stearns Bayou. The Tribune would give no credence to the report except for the fact that it was authenticated by several of our well-known citizens whose reputation and veracity is unimpeachable. Dr. Chase W. Cotton and H. Z. Nyland, with their families of this city, are spending a week's outing at the Gun Club quarters, which has been temporarily christened Nilcott Camp. The cottage is located on a beautiful promontory or high point extending out into the waters of the bayou, about 150 feet to the left or northeast of it. The highway bridge crosses the bayou. On the other side, or to the northwest of the cottage, the waters form a sort of bay, which runs about 300 yards back and is quite weedy and marshy along the south shore, with heavy woods and underbrush surrounding the whole bay on 3 sides. Up at the head of this bay is what has always been known as Clark's Bottomless Pond, and which many believe is the outlet of an underground lake. Last Monday night, the members of the Nilcott party were enjoying the evening on the cottage veranda. About 9:30 o'clock, the men went on a trip to the Sid Clark School to get some ice cream at the social given there. During the men's absence, the ladies heard some of the strangest noises in the vicinity of the bridge. The noise increased and resembled the united drumming of about 200 large sheephead. Interspersed with this drumming were tremendous groanings and barking like the noise of some ferocious animal in anger and distress. The sound approached nearer to the cottage, and the party made a hasty retreat from the porch to the interior. The noise passed by the front of the cottage and the water and into the bay, where it finally ended with a tremendous gulping sound. One of the ladies, in peeping through a drawn shade on the front window, saw a long streak flight flash along the surface of the water of the bay, but was too frightened to make further inspection of the strange moving thing. When the men returned, all was quiet on the water, but they found the rest of the party in a sadly frightened and nervous condition. The men accredited the noises more to the imaginations of the ladies caused by fright and nervousness, so that by little more was thought about the incident until Wednesday evening, when the strange sounds reappeared. Mr. and Mrs. Charles B. Shoup had driven up from this city and were visiting with the Nilecots at the time. The men, more brave than the ladies, ran out to the point to investigate, and the sight they saw is described as that of a hideous-looking beast moving through the waters with a head like a turtle about 6 feet in diameter, and it had a tail about 10 feet long. The undershell, or belly of the beast, gave out a phosphorescent light that lit up the course of the brute like a searchlight under the water. And the 3 men watched the thing as it moved rapidly up the dark bay to the right of the cottage, and as it reached Clark's Pond, it sank below the surface and out of sight with a tremendous gulping sound again. The men agreed with the ladies now that it was not an imaginative thing. 2 repeating rifles were added to the camp equipment yesterday, and a systematic investigation party has been organized. Other campers on Sterren's Bayou report having seen the same mysterious creature, and with the united forces of these and several farmers in the locality, this new specimen of genuine sea serpent, or whatever it may prove to be, will no doubt be bagged within a few days. But it never was. Unfortunately, it would have been interesting to see what the creature actually turned out to be. This next is from the Grand Haven Tribune of August 20th, 1909. Last evening, George Meshepeshew and family, with a launch partly of friends and relatives, went to spend the night at the Gun Club cottage on Sterren's Bayou. Arriving at the cottage about 6:30, they ate supper and shortly before 10 o'clock prepared to retire. After trying in vain to coax sleep, and by counting mental sheep, jumping over an imaginary fence, and various other sleep-producing expedients, Mr. Meshepeshew finally arose and softly made his way out onto the porch. He was careful not to disturb the rest of the party, who, tired out, were sleeping quite soundly. The night was beautiful, with a soft breeze wafted across the starlit waters, and the tiny wavelets gently lapping the shore soon lulled Mac to a state halfway between wakefulness and repose. Thus dozing, he suddenly became conscious of the fact that a dark form was plowing its way across the surface of the lake, moving in the direction of the bridge, and in a moment he was fully awake. The dark object had assumed a dim phosphorus glow which distinctly made visible the outline of a monster turtle-like animal possessing all the characteristics of the prehistoric ages. Its huge elephantine head projected out on a long, slim serpentine neck, and behind trailed a long crocodile-like tail. The creature propelled itself with huge flippers on each side of its round tub-shaped body at a speed which would equal that of a fast motorboat, and at this speed it passed beneath the bridge and for a moment was lost from view. Mac pinched himself to make sure that he wasn't dreaming, and was on the point of calling out to the rest of the party when the creature reappeared, and with a rush of water landed on the beach directly in front of the cottage. To say that Mac was scared is speaking mildly. He was numbed with awesome fear, unable to move or dry out. The monster advanced a few feet up the hill, and with its front flippers, dug a hole in the sand some 3 or 4 feet deep. Backing into the hole, it became perfectly quiet, with the exception of its hideous head, which constantly moved from side to side some 6 or 8 feet above the surface of the ground. Occasionally, it would emit a soft, cat-like purr, which would end with a snort similar to that of a suddenly disturbed hog. At the end of what seemed to Mac an hour, the creature extricated itself from the hole, and after carefully covering it over, slowly moved down towards the water. And at this point, Mac screwed up the courage to call the rest of the party, and the tone of his voice brought them to the door in haste, just in time to witness the creature plunge beneath the waves. As it disappeared, it gave vent to cry or roar which fairly shook the earth. This cry could be compared to the screeching roar of a siren at the waterworks station. The rest of the night was spent in watching for a reappearance of the monster, but day finally broke without another visit. Upon digging where the creature had rested in the sand, a monster egg was found. It was almost perfectly round, yellow in color, embellished with bright red spots, and was about the size of a large pumpkin. The shell of the egg was of tough composition, something like thick leather. At an early hour, the party returned to town, and Mr. Meshepeshew and several women in the party were badly upset over the incident and were suffering from a bad case of the newies today. Unfortunately, while coming home, the egg fell overboard from the hands of one of the party. A careful search was made for it, but seemingly it sank at once. The spot where it disappeared, however, has been marked, and a diver is to be engaged to attempt to recover it. This is in the interest of natural science. Considerable speculation is advancing as to the origin of the monster, but from the description given both by Mr. Meshepeshew and the Nyland Cotton Party, it most probably is a relic of the animals which inhabited these waters in the prehistoric ages. Perhaps an egg deposited ages back by some revolution of nature hatched, and this enclosed creature is the result. An interesting tale, to be sure. But there are many stories told of water monsters being seen on the Great Lakes. Some in prehistory that have been handed down by oral tradition by the Native Americans, some from early settlers, right up through the lumbering days, and right up until recent times. Myself, have I ever seen a lake monster? I can't say that I really have, but I did see something very large in Tawas Lake. I was about 10 years old and vacationing at Pop's cottage with my mom and dad, my brothers and sister, and my dad and I and my brothers were in a rented boat by the river that enters what I think would be the south end of the lake. I'm not sure now. But at any rate, the water there was crystal clear. And I looked over the side and I saw a fish, presumably, possibly a sturgeon, that was longer than the boat as it kind of swum by right above the surface of the bed of the lake or river. There are large creatures that exist in these waters. Some of them not so mysterious, some of them very mysterious. But all of it just goes along with how I feel about Michigan. It's a wonderful, awesome, mysterious place where some enigmatic creatures of God's creation have existed and still exist in the waters beneath the Great Lakes.